So Harry has been associated with Goodwood for the past 30 years, an instructor at the circuit, been involved in the campaign to return to racing, and has driven in both the Revival and the Festival of Speed. He's an author and a very active member of the talks team here at Brooklands. Welcome, Harry Sherrard.
First of all, if you're wondering why a guy from Northern Ireland is doing the Goodwood talk, I've actually lived and worked near Goodwood for more than 30 years now, combined a career in law with involvement in motorsport. So I first actually went down to Goodwood back in 1988 to do some testing of Formula Ford and other cars. There were quite a few sprints at Goodwood in the 80s and 90s. I competed down there. I became an instructor at the racing school. I'll mention that again a little bit later on. I was at the first Festival of Speed in 1993. I then joined I was a early member of the Goodwood Supporters Association, which was a lobbying group to bring motor racing back to the circuit, which of course was successful, the first revival then in 1998. I then raced myself in the revival in 2012. I've been involved for a number of years in a lesser known but still very good Goodwood event, the South Down Stages Rally, for a number of years. I'll tell you more about that later. And then finally in 2017, I ticked another box by driving in the Festival of Speed. And then in 2018, Steve and the Brooklands team asked me to do a talk about Goodwood, and that was precisely 30 years after my first involvement there. So Goodwood describes itself as England's premier sporting estate, which is vividly captured by this marvelous painting which hangs in the kennels, one of the Goodwood clubhouses. So here in the centre we have Goodwood House itself, with the Festival of Speed, of course, happening up the driveway in front of the house. Up at the top here we have the horse racing course, and down here we have the circuit where the revival takes place, and you can see lots of civil aviation going on here, the flying school and the flying club. You can see the farm at Goodwood is actually one of the big organic farms in Europe. If you look very closely in here, you'll see the cricket pavilion and a cricket match going on. In fact, some of the early rules of cricket were set at Goodwood, and those rules are still in the archive. And a couple of golf courses going on here. So a very busy estate. So the Goodwood story began in 1672 with this splendid fellow. He was King Charles II, and he had an eye for the ladies, shall we say. He had a number of mistresses, including one French woman called Louise. She was his favorite mistress, and she bore him a son in 1672. And they called the son Charles after his father. Now, the boy could never be heir to the throne because he was, of course, illegitimate. And that perhaps to some extent, in compensation for that, the king gave him a lot of titles. He gave him the title of the Duke of Richmond, the Earl of March, and Baron Setrington. And those of you who follow Goodwood will know that all of those titles are still in existence up to this day. We're now on the 11th Duke, with one exception, one important exception. They've all been called Charles, and that obviously links directly back to Charles II. So the first Duke came down to Goodwood, first of all, to go hunting, and he clearly liked the place because in 1697 he bought Goodwood House. And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we're now on the 11th Duke, and the estate has been continuously in the ownership of the family now for more than 320 years. Goodwood House didn't look like this back in those days. The original Goodwood House is this section in at the back that you probably don't really get to see very often, rather than this magnificent facade out the front that we're all familiar with. This section was built by later dukes, mainly in the 1800s, but this was the original section, and that's where the first Duke bought. Now, there's lots of valuable art in the house, including, for example, this painting by George Stubbs, a very famous painter of the day. And there are very knowledgeable tour guides at Goodwood House. And when things get back up and running again, I can recommend that you go on one of those tours. They're very, very knowledgeable about the history of the family and the history of the house. The 5th Duke had an uncle who died without issue, and from him, the 5th Duke inherited another dukedom. That's the Dukedom of Gordon. And again, you'll note that the present Duke is called the Duke of Richmond and Gordon. It's a double dukedom there. The 5th Duke also began horse racing in 1802 up at the same site as to where the horse racing takes place now. Now, obviously, this evening I've no time to go through all of the dukes. We'd be here all evening if I did that. But what I can say is that they thankfully for us, they kept the whole estate alive. Various English country residences have been turned into hotels or apartments, or even demolished for that matter over the years. But the dukes had their challenges, they had their ups and downs, including financial ups and downs, but they, thankfully for all of us, they managed to keep the whole estate going to the prosperous location that it is today. So let's fast forward now to the early 1900s, and this was the Lord March of his generation. This was the son of the 8th Duke. He was destined, therefore, to become the 9th Duke. He fought in World War I, but was captured by the Germans and actually spent the latter part of World War I in captivity, eventually then being released in November 1918 at the time of the armistice. Perhaps he felt he hadn't seen enough military action, and he, along with other ex-British military servicemen, volunteered to fight in the Russian Civil War on the side of the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. And Charles was sadly killed in Russia in 1919. So the centenary of his death, of course, was 2019, and the 11th Duke, I know, made a trip to Russia to visit his grave there, on his uncle's grave, on the occasion of that centenary. So Charles, of course, was unmarried, had no children, and therefore on his death, the land and the titles were due to pass to his younger brother, Frederick, who became known as Freddie March, and Goodwood aficionados will know the Freddie March trophy and so forth. So Freddie wasn't born to be the Duke, but he became the Duke, and what an accomplished and fascinating life he led. He was a designer, he was an engineer, he was accomplished in so many different aspects of life, and Goodwood have actually made a film about Freddie, which is very well worth watching. Freddie, of course, was devastated by his elder brother's death, but he had to take on board his new responsibilities. He went to Eton and to Oxford, but up at Oxford, he spent more time with the Oxford Motor Club than he did with his studies, more interested in cars and planes and bikes. And he actually left Oxford with no qualifications, which didn't go down very well with his parents. Now, he then used one of his titles, the Baron Setrington, and converted that into, as it were, a normal surname, and he became plain Mr. Setrington. And using that name, he applied for jobs and was employed by Bentley in London. And it was a real job working for Bentley Motors, lying on his back on concrete floors underneath Bentleys, fixing them. So, he really was genuinely working for a living. His sternly Victorian parents didn't really like any of this. Things then went from bad to worse because they didn't like his girlfriend either, unfortunately. Betty, as seen here on the left. They didn't think she was Duchess material for one reason or another. So quite a bad rift came about between Freddie and his parents. Freddie's allowance was cut off, and he even had to move out of the family flat in London. Just for completeness, to finish the Betty and Freddie story, they did get married. They had 2 children. Their son went on to become the 10th Duke, and they celebrated a diamond wedding together. So that was very much, despite that early disapproval, very much a happy ending. But back to the narrative, fortunately, the rift between Freddie and his parents was reconciled, and his allowance was restored. And what better way to spend it than to go racing at Brooklands? Here Freddie is racing on the banking at Brooklands. That's in 1930. Probably some people on the call know more about that era of cars than I do, but he won the BRDC 500 in an Austin 7 Ulster. And he also won that same year the big race at Brooklands, which was the double 12 in his MG. That's quite a famous photograph of Freddie. Some of you may well have seen that one before. So he had a very successful but very short motor racing career. Having won a number of prestigious races, he then abruptly retired in 1931. It obviously was a very dangerous era. He witnessed a number of bad accidents, and his responsibilities of being the future Duke was wearing down on him. So he gave up driving. But he then became a team manager, and cars managed by Freddie crossed the Irish Sea in 1931, and they won both the Irish Grand Prix and the TT, which then took place at Ards. So in 1935, the 8th Duke died, and the main titles and the land then passed to Freddie. And to celebrate his elevation to the dukedom, he held a motoring fun day at Goodwood House. And amongst the activities at the motoring fun day was a hill climb up the road in front of Goodwood House. Now you can all see where this is going. This was the event which 60 years later inspired his son to start the Festival of Speed. So it only happened once in period, 1935. It's not a terribly good photograph, a bit blurry, but I think it's the only one of Freddie actually driving up the hill in the hill climb. So the end of the 30s, approaching 1939, of course, Second World War broke out. Freddie and Betty moved out of Goodwood House and left the main house to become a hospital, and they lived in an apartment in round the back. Freddie joined the RAF, and he was eventually assigned to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and that spent quite a lot of time in America in the latter stages of the war, at least. Now in 1940, summer of 1940, we of course had the Battle of Britain. And RAF Tangmere down here is just a few miles from Goodwood rather. Now, Tangmere was a permanent brick-built RAF base, had been there since the First World War, so the Luftwaffe had all the aerial reconnaissance photographs of Tangmere they could possibly want. So the need was established for a dispersal airdrome in the vicinity. And a survey of some land on Westhampnett Farm, which was part of the Goodwood estate, established that there was a suitable flat area there for a dispersal airdrome. Freddie was approached, and he agreed to have the dispersal airdrome built there, and that therefore became RAF Westhampnett. Now, this is, I think, probably one of the very earliest photographs of RAF Westhampnett. In the Battle of Britain era, it was very, very basic indeed. It was basically tents and just a few pre-existing buildings. But into 41, 42, it began to be more developed. And it was discovered that the Goodwood land got quite wet in the winter, and it wasn't possible for the tankers and other vehicles to go out to service the aircraft. So the decision was made to build a perimeter road. And I find this a fascinating photograph because you can follow the outline around here. Those of you who are familiar with Goodwood, you can see it. And the perimeter road is clearly under construction in this actual photograph. This then was the airdrome. And if you're looking at this thinking, well, how could that be an airdrome with all these hedges everywhere and possibly some sort of little building? Well, that's what you're supposed to think, but more importantly, that's what the Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots were supposed to think, because these lines are actually fake. They're made with tar on the grass, so that from the air they look like hedges, and in actual fact, all of this area here within the perimeter road was completely open, and that was the operational airdrome. And it actually worked because RAF Westhampnett was never attacked. There wasn't a single pound of German ordnance ever fell on RAF Westhampnett. Unlike the mother station of Tangmere up the road, which was heavily bombed several times. Now, the menfolk of Sussex in 1941-42 were, of course, heavily engaged in fighting Hitler. And a large group of Irish labourers were brought across, and it was actually them who built the perimeter road. So one of the lesser known facts about Goodwood is that it was actually built by the Irish. This is someone I'm sure most of you recognise, Douglas Bader, a courageous and inspirational double amputee. He wasn't based at Westhampnett during the Battle of Britain, but he came down there in 1941, the following year. And in fact, his famous last operational flight, when he was shot down over France, that actually flight began from RAF Westhampnett. And he spent the rest of the war in Colditz, of course. There was a bronze statue then revealed to Douglas Bader in 2001 on the 60th anniversary of him being shot down. And I was present, actually. I was at the opening ceremony, and that Lady Bader, his widow, was also there. Since I took that photograph, the statue's moved, actually. It's now outside the Flying Club. So here we are later in the war, 1943, these wonderful typhoons on the outskirts of the RAF Westhampnett. So this little bit of tarmac here, if you know your corners at Goodwood, this would go on to become Madgwick. It's actually Madgwick Corner here. So these pilots are returning from attacking V1 launching sites in France. So you can see Westhampnett continued to be a very important base, and of course on into then D-Day in June 1944. Again, that Westhampnett had an important role to play there. So if I've whetted your appetite for fighter pilot stories from Westhampnett, here's a couple more, a couple for you to read. Johnny Johnson and Hugh Dundas, they were both based at Westhampnett during the war. They both flew with Bader, in fact, and two really excellent books there. Now, also based at Westhampnett was an Australian pilot called Tony Gaze. Now, Tony had raced in Australia prior to the war, and he was to have a profound and lasting impact on the Goodwood story. So this is what he had to say in an interview later in life. I had an MG, and so did another pilot officer, Dickie Stewart. When the perimeter track was finished, I looked at it one morning and said, I think it's time we christened this thing. So Dickie and I got into our MGs and went batting around, anti-clockwise as it happened. I'll come back to that anti-clockwise point later on. After a while, we persuaded one or two other chaps to join in, and whenever there was nothing else going on, to have a race around. That's how it went. So there you go. If you've ever wondered how motor racing started at Goodwood, that's the answer. It actually took place during the war between serving pilots. Now, the reason I put the two of them together there is because Tony Gaze went to Freddie, or met Freddie in 1946 after the war was over, and said to Freddie, when are we going to start racing at Westhampnett? And Freddie didn't know what he was talking about. Now, I'd always kind of known that story that Tony Gaze had suggested racing at Goodwood, or at Westhampnett as it then was. And I'd always kind of wondered to myself, well, why did Freddie not suggest it himself? After all, as we saw, he was a pre-war racer, and of course the potential track was on his land. And after a bit more research and thinking about it, what I realized was Freddie had never been there. Now, I know it sounds extraordinary when we think of the very, very close association between the present Duke and the circuit. But if you think about it, pre-war, Westhampnett was just a couple of unremarkable fields. By the time the war was over, the place was an absolute mess. It was full of deteriorating buildings, war scrap and debris, all the detritus of war. It really was a complete and utter mess. So Fred had no reason to go there, and he didn't. But once Tony Gaze told him that he potentially had a racetrack on his property, he, of course, naturally immediately went down and had a look, drove around it and thought, yes, it does have potential. He brought down some people from the RAC and other motorsport people. Everybody thought about it and decided that, yes, it had potential and that they would give it a go. So Westhampnett was renamed the Goodwood Motor Circuit, and a massive tidy up job. I mean, I think it took more than a year. It gives you an idea of what a mess the place was. It took more than a year, but by 1948, they were good to go. And this is a poster for that first ever meeting, 18th of September, 1948. As you can see, it was just a single day meeting. 2 shillings, it costs a little bit more now. If you're familiar with Goodwood, again, you will actually quite quickly, I think, realised that the basic layout of the place hasn't changed at all. So this is that first meeting in 1948. Luckily, they had a nice dry day, everybody out in the open like that. But along here would be where the pit garages now, the white pit garages are now located. This grass here would be the pit lane, and this would still be start-finish straight. Along here, we have the little road that adjoins the paddock onto the circuit. Lots of these wartime buildings have now gone, but of course this one down here survived, and that became an iconic part of the Goodwood infrastructure. That became the Super Shell building. And that of course is still there to this day. So the control tower would have been here as well. So it's just off to the right, just to the right of that photograph, just out of shot. That was obviously a wartime building as well. And I'm always slightly amused when I look at this matting here. Goodwood use that kind of stuff to this day, getting you in and out of the car park, and there they are using it in the very first meeting in 1948. So there's nothing new, as the saying goes. Yes, for a generation hardened by the war years, spectator safety wasn't a big priority in that 1948. As you can see, another shot of that first meeting. So for us, Brooklands members, of course, our late departed President Stirling Moss. You can see him there lining up in number 7 in his Cooper Jap, and he raced at that first meeting in 1948, and that was his first ever race. He had done a little bit of time trials type of things and hill climbs and things, but this was his first actual race. And he went on to develop, of course, a very strong association with Goodwood. And when I raced there in 2012, I'll always remember at breakfast time sitting down at the same table as Sir Stirling Moss. So to be on the same bill as him at Goodwood, that was quite a special moment. Needless to say, he went on to win that race, that first race at a canter. So the meeting was a success, and decision was taken to carry on with races in subsequent years. In 1951, there was a motorcycle race, and there was only one actually. At the Revival, of course, there's a motorcycle race every year, but back in period, it only happened that one time in 1951. The following year, then they installed the chicane. If I just go back a second to the Stirling Moss picture, so the chicane went into this location here. So it was felt that then as now, the pit lane was here. Pit crews were too exposed to cars coming around this corner at high speed. So to make it safer for them and also to reduce a little bit the approach speed from Madgwick, the chicane was then installed into this location here. Now, I don't know whose great idea it was to build a brick wall right in the middle of a race circuit, but literally that's what there were, 2 brick walls. In fact, as you can see, that is literally bricks and mortar that the original chicane was actually built. And needless to say, it was flipping dangerous. That I think is Jean Berra. I think that's a Maserati 250F that he hit, and I think he broke bones. He was, was quite seriously hurt. So yes, not the material of choice, I think, for building racetrack infrastructure. Thankfully, these days it's no longer made of bricks, and I'll show you a photograph of the modern chicane later on. Fangio raced at Goodwood once. There he is skimming the brick wall with about half an inch to spare, it looks. He raced a BRM, not really a make we normally associate with Fangio. That was 1953, and he finished second in that race. So there never was a Grand Prix at Goodwood. Sometimes people think that the British Grand Prix used to be there. It wasn't, but there were a good number of non-championship races, and back then the Grand Prix wasn't the be-all and end-all. It was the non-championship races were prestigious in themselves, and they attracted all the big stars, and the big teams would go down to Goodwood to race. Also lots of saloon racing. Again, I'm sure many of you recognize Graham Hill there in the Austin leading. Different times. Back then, Graham Hill was an established Formula One driver, but everybody drove everything. And there he is also racing in a saloon car. It's kind of hard to imagine Lewis Hamilton racing a Fiesta. But that's effectively the equivalent. And I like this picture because it has a Sunbeam Rapier racing in period, and that of course was the car which I raced when I raced at Goodwood in 2012. So some famous sports car races there as well, the TT and the 9 Hours. This is one of my favorite Goodwood photographs. This is Jim Clark in 1962 in the Aston Martin Zagato with a fantastic four-wheel drift through Madgwick Corner. I think that picture also tells you another bit of a story, really, because we're now into the early 60s and still very little in the way of infrastructure in terms of safety for spectators and so forth. And it was those kinds of issues that would ultimately lead to the demise of Goodwood as a racetrack in period. So this is the same year and the same race, in fact, as far as I can make out. The RAC banned Le Mans starts in 1962, and this is 1962, so I think this must be the last ever Le Mans start at Goodwood. And this here, I think that is Jim Clark there, with the blue helmet running towards the Zagato there that we saw in the preceding photograph. So being obviously banned, the Le Mans start, Goodwood can't, as part of the revival, replicate that, but someone came up with the brilliant idea of the Setrington Cup, where there is a Le Mans start, and I'll come back and show you that later on. It's a lot of fun. Interesting as well, I think, to look at the paddock there in period, and it's fair to say, you know, the revival revived what happened in this period, but equally the Goodwood these days, the modern Goodwood, is actually much nicer, really, than Goodwood was in period. It was a place that had a lot of appeal and a lot of charm, but you know, it was a little bit rough around the edges here and there as well. It wasn't the very, very well kept place that we know from the present day. Now, this is obviously a modern aerial photograph of Goodwood, but the reason I put it up is just to show you the location of Stirling Moss's accident. So Stirling Moss began and ended his career at Goodwood because he crashed there in 1962. I quite often read that Stirling Moss crashed at St Mary's, which actually isn't correct. St Mary's is the left-hander here. He crashed at the right-hander there, which us Goodwood regulars call No Name because it doesn't have a name. So Ford Water here, round to No Name, and as you can see, coming off at No Name is like the worst place to come off, really, because even to this day there is hardly any runoff there, and you are going very quickly at that point. And so that, in fact, is where he crashed. And here's a photograph of his car after that accident, and it's pretty incredible, really, that he survived. I mean, that's the front of the car, that's his seat. So it's just astonishing that he actually got out of that in relatively one piece. He was obviously in hospital for a number of months afterwards, but lived to tell the tale. So going on another couple of years, this is an amazing photograph taken in the Goodwood pit lane in 1964. And there are actually four legends of the sport in this photograph. Here we have John Cooper, and this car is actually a Cooper Formula 3 car. On the left, we have Ken Tyrrell. In the car, I'm sure you've all recognized him, Jackie Stewart, and standing behind here we have Bruce McLaren. Now, all four of these guys had Formula One teams. Stewart became Jaguar, became Red Bull. Tyrrell became BAR, became Honda, became Braun, became Mercedes, and of course McLaren is still McLaren. So that the DNA of the teams that these three guys started are actually still racing in Formula One to this day. And of course, John Cooper still has a very strong connection with minis and so forth. So the story behind this photograph, Jackie Stewart was an up-and-coming sports car driver. He had no real interest in single-seaters, but he won a race at Goodwood, and the circuit manager was friendly with Ken Tyrrell. Rang Ken Tyrrell up and said, there's this young Scottish lad, I think you should give him a try. So Jackie Stewart came down. He'd never driven a single-seater before, got to Goodwood, and Bruce McLaren here got in the car and set a kind of benchmark time. Jackie Stewart then got in the car, and within 4 laps, he'd gone faster than Bruce McLaren. McLaren got back into the car again, and the same thing happened. Jackie Stewart got in again and went quicker still. So nobody was in any doubt that there was a superstar on their hands. He was signed up for the 1964 Formula 3 season, which he dominated, and that success propelled Jackie Stewart straight into Formula One the following year. And here he is back at Goodwood in his Formula One BRM in 1965, with just that single year of single-seater racing under his belt. Now, kind of remarkable thing happened that day. As if you look at the circuit lap record down here, Jim Clark was also in that race, April 1965, set a lap record of 1 minute 20.4. Jackie Stewart in the BRM, 1 minute 20.4. So the two great Scottish drivers set a joint lap record. They only did it to 1 decimal place in those days. Now, you might be thinking that this document here, I've pulled this out of some kind of archived document. Actually, I haven't. This was from the program when I raced at Goodwood in 2012. So through all the early years of the revival, nobody ever beat the Clark-Stewart lap record. Eventually then in 2015, a driver of a Can-Am car did beat that record. And I was a little sad with that. I always liked the fact that the Clark-Stewart lap record kind of stood for all time. But it did stand for 50 years from right from 1965 through to 2015 when it was eventually broken. By the mid-60s, Goodwood was in decline, and in 1966, in fact, there was no Formula One race there. But again, times were different. The Formula One drivers also raced in Formula Two. So the final first-class motor race at Goodwood before the closure in 1966 was a Formula Two race. And as they set off on the first lap of that race, this was the running order. Jack Brabham, Denny Hulme, Jackie Stewart, Graham Hill, Jim Clark, and Jochen Rindt. Now, those of you who are good on your 60s and 70s Formula One history will, of course, immediately realize that what those six guys all have in common is all world champions, all past, present, or future world champions. I wonder if that's ever happened anywhere else. 6 world champions in a row. And there is Jack Brabham winning that race. So it was quite a send-off. But for various financial, regulatory, and safety reasons, Freddie closed Goodwood for racing in 1966. Freddie by then was in his 60s, and I think just couldn't take on what was required to build all the infrastructure to keep racing there. But the track did stay open for testing, and this is the McLaren Can-Am team just a couple of years later, 1968. Here we have Denny Hulme, Bruce McLaren, and the team manager Teddy Mayer. 2 years later in 1970, 2nd of June 1970, a scene very reminiscent of this. Again, the McLaren team came down to test their Can-Am cars. That probably was Goodwood's saddest day because Bruce McLaren was driving, some of the bodywork came off, and he lost control and was unfortunately killed. So last year, of course, we had the 50th anniversary of Bruce McLaren's death at Goodwood. So testing carried on. Obviously, these days, cars have electronics and sensors and so forth, and the telemetry gets beamed back to rows of computers in the pit lane. Back in that era, data acquisition was a little bit more low tech. So believe it or not, that's actually a tire technician hanging on for dear life, going around doing laps, watching how the tires are behaving. I think that was before health and safety was invented. So I mentioned earlier on that competitions did still take place at Goodwood, and there were plenty of sprints. I won my first trophy in this car, Van Diemen Multisport, down there in 1996, and there were big entries of cars for sprints. There also was a race school there run by Peter Gethin. He won the Italian Grand Prix in 1971 and was a big name in the Formula 5000 as well. I went down in 1991 and auditioned for Peter, and he took me on as a part-time motor racing instructor at Goodwood. And I then spent the next part of best part of the next decade instructing motor racing there, and obviously drove hundreds of laps of the circuit during that period. Now, as well as instructing aspiring racing drivers, we also did events for car dealers, and this obviously is for the Ferrari importer, but these are photographs that I took actually during a Ferrari day that I did in 1994, and you can see how Goodwood looked then. We've got these tin sheds where the pit lane, and you can see, or the pits rather, pit garages, and this rough grass and gravel. This is where the lovely wooden garages of the paddock now exist. So as you can see, a heck of a lot of work had to be done in a short space of time to turn Goodwood from this rather kind of slightly neglected look to the Goodwood that we know today. So Freddie then died in 1989. I kind of like the fact that I was active at Goodwood in 88 and 89, so I was kind of active while he was still alive and still there. This is a little pen and ink drawing of Freddie that hangs in the Royal Automobile Club in Pall Mall. I took a photograph of it a couple of years ago. What an amazing era to have lived through. Freddie saw some of the very first cars, and his parents had one of the first cars in the south of England. He was there at the start of aviation as well. He lived through 2 world wars, the Apollo moon landings, computers, mobile phones. What absolute momentous change he witnessed in his life. I can't imagine any other generation will ever live through such change that he saw. Freddie told the story that later in life he went over to the States, and his PA had booked a hotel room for him, and he was pretty modest, Freddie. He didn't throw around his titles very much at all, and he went under the name of either Freddie March, and of course in motor racing terms that's how he was known, Freddie March, also Freddie Richmond. So he tried to book into the hotel. He said, "I think you have a reservation for Freddie March," and the receptionist said, "No sir, I'm afraid we don't." So he thought to himself, well, maybe my PA has used the title. So Freddie said, "Do you, by any chance, do you have a booking in the name of the Duke of Richmond?" And the receptionist replied, said, "Oh yes, sir, we do indeed. We've booked a suite for the Duke of Richmond with an adjoining room for Gordon." So Freddie and Betty's son, as I mentioned earlier on, became the 10th Duke. He then died in September 2017, and the man we'd known up to that point as Lord March then became the Duke. The 10th Duke wasn't really a car man, and to some extent he doesn't feature very prominently in the story, but he actually had quite an important role because, as I was saying a few minutes ago, testing and sprints, etc., did carry on at Goodwood, and he maintained the circuit at a level. He didn't close it down completely or allow it to fall into neglect. And because he did that, effectively that made the revival possible. If he'd allowed it to decay completely, then his son probably wouldn't have been able to have actually launched the revival. So although he sort of sits in the background a little bit in the story, the 10th Duke did have an important role to play. Now, by family tradition, the heir takes over at aged 40, and in 1993, Lord March then reached that age, and being the future 11th Duke, and his first initiative was to launch the Festival of Speed, as I mentioned earlier on, inspired by an event that his grandfather ran 60 years previously. I was there. I actually took this photograph myself of that first event. Couple of things to remark. First of all, pretty basic. Obviously, there's lots of infrastructure these days. That first event just literally had a row of straw bales up the drive, and that was it. But also, it was a massive success from the start. Here you can see some contemporary Formula One cars. Look in the background there, you can actually make out the McLaren F1 transporter. So it was a massive success instantly, and of course went on for strength to strength after that. So another poignant photograph. This is Sir Stirling Moss at a later iteration of the Festival of Speed, driving one of my favourite cars. This is the Ferguson Formula One car. It's the only four-wheel drive Formula One car to have actually won a race. He won Stirling won the Gold Cup at Oulton Park in that car. So it was quite poignant to see him driving that up the hill. So the success of the Festival of Speed started to build momentum towards the return of racing at the circuit. And the Goodwood Supporters Association was formed, and I was an early member of that. It was a kind of lobbying group. I mean, we met up for talks and all that kind of thing as well, but it was a lobbying group to try to persuade the local authorities to grant planning permission for racing to return. So I lived in Sussex, as I mentioned earlier on, near the circuit. So we were asked to write to local government, which we did. And it was a long and heavily involved process, all the planning applications and noise abatement and all the rest of it. but the Goodwood team did a fantastic job, and they secured planning permission, and racing from 1998 was allowed to return to the circuit. Lord March then threw a big party in the Goodwood House to celebrate, and the Goodwood Supporters Association were invited along. That was a memorable do. So, as I said, the first revival then took place in September 1998. And if any of you were there that day and you're anywhere near the pit straight, you certainly won't forget this. This was Ray Hanna, who flew his Spitfire at 0 feet down the pit lane, or not the pit lane, the start-finish straight, I should say. These aren't terribly good photographs. Obviously, in 1998, there weren't digital cameras around, and the whole thing happened so fast that the professionals didn't really get any decent shots. So this is a couple of photographs that were taken by spectators, but it really was absolutely amazing. I know somebody who was in this control tower here, and he was actually looking down into the cockpit of Ray Hanna's Spitfire. So yeah, everybody was very impressed by that, apart from the CAA. So yeah, poor old Ray Hanna did get his knuckles wrapped for that, I'm afraid. So the revival continued and went on from strength to strength. This is my car, which I raced there in 2012. It's a 2-driver Pro-Am race, St Mary's Trophy. So I shared with Derek Daly, who's a former Formula One IndyCar and sports car driver, and he came over from the States especially to race with me. So it was a massive project for us, getting the entry, finding the car, rebuilding the car, getting Derek over from America. It was a huge project, but very rewarding and absolutely fantastic experience. And there we are. The theme of the party, sorry, Freddie always invited the drivers along to a party, and his grandson did likewise, the famous Goodwood Revival party that we went to on the Saturday night. The theme of that party was Dr. Zhivago and the Russian Revolution, with lots of actors dressed up as Cossacks and things. So it was, again, a very memorable evening. So I mentioned earlier on the Setterton Cup, what a genius idea. You can't have a real Le Mans start for real cars, but the kids can do that and run across to the pedal cars, which is a lot of fun. And they then pedal like furiously up the start-finish straight. So it's a very popular, and it's a real hit now at Goodwood, the Setterton Cup. So the chicane these days is made out of kind of fake bricks. It looks a little bit like bricks, but they're actually made out of polystyrene, thankfully. So in the old days, the chicane wrecked the cars, but nowadays the cars wreck the chicane, which I'm sure you agree is the better way round. So it's a little bit blurry, that picture. It's actually a still from a video rather than a photograph as such. I'm always intrigued by these marshals standing over here. There's this massive accident going on behind them, and they're looking in the opposite direction for some strange reason. They don't seem to have noticed it. Now, this is Goodwood, as many of you may not have seen it before. And the observant amongst you will notice two things. First of all, it's night. Obviously, you can see all the lights of the service crews here in the paddock working on the cars. But the other notable thing, of course, is that the car is going the wrong way. It's going in the wrong direction. Now, this is part of the rally that I mentioned in my opening that I've been involved with for a number of years, the South Down Stages rally. And for one part of the event, we run the stage on the circuit. It's always in the winter, by the way, so it's always freezing and usually wet. But we run one part of the rally anti-clockwise around the circuit, which I think is great. I think it's a marvelous little nod to Tony Gaze and those wartime pilots that actually started racing at Goodwood, that at least one day a year, Goodwood is actually used in that anti-clockwise direction. So I've taken part quite a few times in my Mini. So I've come up the pit lane here. Instead of going straight on out onto the circuit, I've done a U-turn and I'm heading out, and I'm about to head round the circuit in an anti-clockwise direction. So I'm going to now play you a video. This is an in-car video of me going around Goodwood. I'm sure many of you have done track days. You're all quite familiar with the clockwise way around Goodwood. I'm going to show you going around Goodwood in an anti-clockwise direction. So I'll have to fiddle with the controls a little bit to get the sound working, but hopefully that will play, and you will be able to hear some sound. Sorry, I'm just turning the sound down a little bit now. It's too loud. So this is the car park on the right as you come into Goodwood. The car park on the right immediately by the gate, set up as part of the stage. So yes, wet and pretty cold in February. That's the Tesco as well. So now we're going out onto the circuit near the chicane. So turning right now and heading anti-clockwise around the circuit. There's the Super Shell building that we mentioned earlier on. This is the runoff area for Woodcote. We turn that into an extra little bit of circuit to make a kind of chicane. So now we're heading the wrong way up the Lavin Straight. That bit. Lavin was very slippy that year. So we're coming up to St Mary's now. It's the only left-hander at Goodwood. Obviously now it's going to be a right-hander. Just check out on the left this little blast pen that we go through. I'll show you that later. So we're coming up to No Name corner. This is No Name, and over on the right hand side, that's where Sterling Mott's crashed. That was No Name. We're heading now up towards Fordwater. This bit on the left always stays wet, that's why I'm keeping out a bit. And on very cold days when we have the rally, that always stays icy, so literally there's ice on the circuit. So this is the runoff for Matchwick. Back out onto the circuit. So those Typhoons that we looked at earlier on, yeah, they were parked here on the grass just there. So there you are, an anti-clockwise lap of Goodwood. I hope you enjoyed that. So I mentioned that in 2017 then I took part in the Festival of Speed. So Race to Recovery is a charity that I've been involved with for some years, aiding injured servicemen, people who've lost limbs and things in Afghanistan. And that we set up a deal whereby I was driving this M Sport R5 rally car, which was an absolute rocket ship, fastest thing I've ever driven. But I took some of the ex-servicemen around the rally stage. It was a lot of fun, and of course great to be part of the Festival of Speed. Not least because you do get to bump into all the stars. So this is Valtteri Bottas. He turned up in the driver's lounge with a kind of a minder guy who was obviously making it clear that there weren't going to be any photographs. So I had to kind of stalk him a little bit to get the picture. I followed him into the men's changing rooms, hung around in the corner for a little while, and picked an appropriate moment, and then asked him for a photograph. And he was absolutely fine with that in the absence of the minder. So a quick bit of Goodwood trivia for you. Who knows, obviously this works better with a live audience, who knows the fastest car that's ever driven around Goodwood? And note my question, the fastest car, I didn't say the car that holds the lap record, not the Can-Am car that holds the lap record. In fact, the fastest car to drive around Goodwood was in fact Bluebird. Donald Campbell took Bluebird down there in 1960. I gather he reached about 100 miles an hour here and there on the straights, but bearing in mind that Bluebird only had 4 degrees of steering lock, he wasn't going to be setting any lap records. I think this is on YouTube actually. I think if you search Bluebird at Goodwood or something like that on YouTube, you can actually find some footage of this. And here at Brooklands TV, we're having an event actually on the 25th of March. Our next event is all about Donald Campbell. It's marking the centenary of his birth. And his daughter Gina and his nephew will also be on the call. So hopefully some of you will join us for that interesting talk. Now I mentioned earlier on about the lap record at Goodwood, 1 minute 20 seconds in 1965, then lowered to 1 minute 18 seconds in 2015 by the Can-Am car. I actually shattered the Goodwood lap record myself. I went round in 1 minute 15 seconds, but there was some cheating involved. First of all, I was driving a modern Formula 3 car with lots of downforce and slick tires. And secondly, I was actually in a simulator. So this is a professional race driver simulator. It's in Paris actually for training serious drivers. And the software people came over and did a very detailed scan of Goodwood and put together this program, which is absolutely fantastic. It replicates all the little curbs and all the little joins in the tarmac and the bumps and everything. It's all set out as per the revival, so all the marshals have white coats and all this kind of thing. So it really is excellent if you ever get a chance to drive that. It's sort of the next best thing to actually driving in the revival. So on our left, we have a wartime aerial photograph of Goodwood, of Westhampnett, I should say, as it was called then, towards the latter end of the war. And here we have from our friend, Mr. Google, the current shape. And as you can see rather, the shape of Goodwood hasn't changed at all. It's absolutely identical to that perimeter road at the end of the war. That's not the case with everywhere, of course. Like Silverstone, for example, was a bomber base, and it's really unrecognizable now from the war. But all of Goodwood follows that perimeter track absolutely faithfully. I mentioned, well, you can see all the blast pens around here to protect the aircraft from attack. Only one of them remains, and if you picked it out, I think I mentioned it on the way around. We use that on the rally as a little chicane into that one remaining blast pen there. I think there's probably a little bit, the tarmac's probably a little bit wider down here at the chicane, but other than that, the circuit is, as you can see, identical. So this would be an aviator's view of Goodwood. Runway 32 is the main runway. The prevailing wind is a westerly coming along this way, so mainly landing here on that runway 32. But there are a number of other runways as well running across and running down here. Goodwood does have a bit of a drainage problem, and they did suffer a little bit from wet ground there. So there's a big drainage program which has put in a few years ago, which has improved that significantly. This is Goodwood from the south. So here we have the circuit. Over here we have Goodwood House, so you can see it's pretty close. And I think that the Festival of Speed is either being built up or deconstructed at this time. There's a lot of activity and trucks up there at the house. Over here we have the Rolls-Royce factory. Visible obviously from an aerial shot, but not visible from ground level, because it was lowered. It was built in a kind of a sunken location, so that it has very little visibility for passers-by. And you can go on tours at the Rolls-Royce factory, so I recommend you do that if you ever get the chance. So obviously I've talked mainly about the motor racing side of things. Goodwood said they are the world's most beautiful race course. I've not been to many race courses, but I can certainly say that its location in the South Downs is absolutely beautiful. It's a stunning location for a racetrack. It's kind of made for it, really. And the Queen, of course, came down for racing there. I guess that's probably what, late 50s, early 60s, and that's the Queen there with Freddie at a horse race meeting. So as I mentioned earlier, the 10th Duke died in September 2017, and that same year, the start-finish straight at Brooklands was opened, and Lord March, as he then was, I think he became the Duke later in the year. I think he was still Lord March at the time. He came along to open, or should I say reopen, the finishing straight that his grandfather had raced on and won the double 12 race 87 years previously. So it's nice to keep that little connection going there between Brooklands and Goodwood. So as I said, Lord March then became the Duke in September 2017, and under his leadership, Goodwood really has become the most incredible estate. 12,000 acres in total, the motor circuit, Goodwood House, the race course, we've looked at all of these, 4,000 acre organic farm, 2 18-hole golf courses, the aerodrome and the flying school, clay shooting ground, 91-bedroom hotel, health and fitness club, the Kennels Clubhouse. I'm looking forward to going back there shortly when they reopen. Likewise, the Farmer Butcher Chef restaurant. The Hound Lodge, that's a kind of a high-end lodge that you can rent to stay in. The Rolls-Royce Motor Factory that we mentioned earlier on, employing 550 people and attracting some 800,000 visitors to the estate each year. So, as I say, a really fantastic organisation. So finally, on a subject which attracted a bit of controversy over the last few years, but unlike some venues and some series, I'm pleased to say that for reasons of historic authenticity, Goodwood do still employ suitably attired grid girls. So there you are. That's the conclusion of the talk. Thank you very much, everyone. Do we have any questions, Steve? And Tim, are you now going to come in for me?
In fact, we've got Matthew Eastall, who was the author of the other Q&As.
Wide range of subjects, and I've enjoyed it very much. Fascinating.
Good, thank you.
It wasn't tuning, Harry. I was just trying to get some free instruction on how I can get a bit quicker, really, round the course. But I know over a computer, there's no substitute for doing it. But yeah, just if you've got a small car, any secret racing lines you would do in an old Mini and not in a fast car?
There are a few little trick lines. I always remember that we did Aston Martin days, and the drummer from Pink Floyd, oh gosh, I'm going to forget his name now. Nick Mason, the drummer from Pink Floyd, came down, and I was instructing Nick, really nice guy, and I showed him a little sort of trick line at Lavant. And if you get the turn in just right at Lavant, you can actually take the whole corner without actually moving the wheel again. It's quite satisfying if you get it right. And every time I see Nick Mason racing at Goodwood or driving at Goodwood, I always wonder, does he still remember that little tip that I gave him all those years ago? But other than that, there is a racing school there, Matthew. Hopefully they'll be operating again pretty soon, and there will be I'm quite sure one of the instructors there will be able to give you lots of tips on how to drive more quickly around Goodwood.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to be back there on the 8th of May with my motor club. We've got a sprint running there. But yeah, it will certainly enrich my visit going back there, knowing all the things that you've shared with us tonight. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah. Okay, no problem, Matthew. Thanks for being on the webinar.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. I've got Brian Small now with a question. Brian.
To be honest, I'm not quite sure what happened there, because I didn't necessarily have a question for you, but I am interested in the members meeting and what you think the future for the members meeting is, which I think is actually possibly for motorsport enthusiasts the best of the meetings now. I'm a Goodwood Road and Racing Club member and actually have competed myself there.
Yeah, well, the members' meeting, of course, is pushed off to the autumn, which I think is good. I think it's a nice way to end the season rather than beginning the season. So, you can still have the race into darkness and all that kind of stuff. So, I think an autumn members' meeting is fine. Actually, slightly frustrating to not get to Goodwood as early as we hoped in the year, but I think they've come up with a pretty good outcome there. friends who are professional racing drivers have warned me against taking my classic around Goodwood as it's a car breaker. Well, it is a dangerous circuit, a relatively dangerous circuit. Somewhere like Silverstone has miles and miles of runoff. If you go off there, you're pretty safe to end up in a gravel bed. Whereas if you go off at Goodwood, as I mentioned in the talk, certain parts of the circuit have very little runoff. So, you know, it depends on how fast you want to drive it, Colin. You know, if you want to experience Goodwood, you know, it's not compulsory. I used to say this to people when I was instructing there. It's not compulsory to thrash your car to death just because you're driving on a race circuit. You know, you can actually drive around Goodwood at a kind of a half sensible speed, but keeping plenty in reserve so you're not going to go off, and enjoy the experience of the circuit. So, you know, you don't have to absolutely thrash it. I think that answers.
So we've got Alan Morecambe. Alan, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Harry.
Hi,
enjoyed your presentation, and I noticed you mentioned the Peter Gethin Racing School.
Yep.
And I went there for a very enjoyable day many years ago. I bumped into a guy called Callum Lockie. And I wondered if you remember Callum, and I think he was a professional racing driver. And whether you do remember him, and if you've got anything to say.
I think Callum Lockie is still active. I think he runs a company called Gold Track that he organises track days. I think that's the same person that we're thinking about. If I'm not getting confused, but yeah, I'm pretty sure he is still active in the field. Yeah. So I wonder if I instructed you that day, but maybe you don't remember me. What year was it, Alan? Can you remember the year?
Oh wow! It must have been about 1993 or 4, 5.
Yeah. I was pretty active down there in those days, so it could well have been me. Sarah here has asked a question. Sarah Mayhead, what did you think of the rally stage at Speedweek? I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I think we put on a decent show at the Southdown stages. Obviously, we've got spectators and so forth, so we can't use all the tunnels and one thing and another. But I really thought that the rally stage, watching it, was just brilliant. And I think they are going to run something similar, maybe not quite using all of the circuit that they did at Speedweek, but I think they're going to run something similar at the members meeting, hopefully. That was really, really good.
Yep. Okay, we've got Ross panel here. Ross, if you go ahead.
Hi, Harry. How are you?
Oh, hi, Ross. How you doing? Yeah, good to well, not see you, but hear your voice. How you doing?
Thank you very much. That was a great talk. I'm a massive fan of Goodwood, and I've been a member for around 12 years now, I think. But yeah, just wondering if you were likely to be racing again at any of the events, what cars you're still running. I know they sort of alternate St Mary's trophies between eras at the Revival, but yeah, just wondered if you had any plans for any of the events soon.
No, I've kind of switched disciplines a bit these days, Ross. I have an old early Audi 80 Quattro, 1983 Audi Quattro, so I'm intending to do historic rallying these days. But my car is let's say it's a recreation of an Audi Quattro rally car. It's not actually an original, so it wouldn't really meet the standards of Goodwood. For their rally stages, they would obviously want the real McCoy and cars that actually competed in period. My sort of reproduction wouldn't really cut the mustard, I'm afraid, quite rightly as well. I mean, Goodwood needs to keep those standards up. So no, I don't think I'll be competing at Goodwood other than potentially in the Southdown stages in the near future, Ross.
Sure. No, thanks very much.
Okay, no worries. I must give you a call someday.
For sure, definitely.
Okay, cheers.
Okay, I think someone asked a question in the chat. Christopher says, how are entrants and exhibits chosen for the Revival?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm going to have to pass on that one. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of the selection of cars and drivers and guests. It's a very complex issue, so I'm afraid I'm not going to able to go on to that one on this call, I'm afraid.
Okay, and we have a raised hand from Steve Brown. Steve, if you go ahead.
Okay, great talk, Harry. I too am an original GSA member, and I really loved the talks that we used to have with the drivers that used to come and speak to us, particularly those of like Murray Walker and Derek Bell. They were real fun evenings. It's a shame those are not continued. What do you reckon?
Well, in a way they do, Steve. They actually continue at Brooklands. because at Brooklands we have all manner of drivers coming along. John Watson's coming quite soon. I think we've number. Obviously, it's all been disrupted over the last year, but can I encourage you to join the Brooklands members and to come to the talks that we organise there? I think it's actually quite close to what we used to have with the GSA, actually.
Okay. I'll look into that.
Yeah, do, and I'll hopefully see you at Brooklands at some point in the next few months, Dave.
Harry, can I just comment on that? The gentleman that's just asked the question. Yeah, for sure. We have over the years had a huge amount of competitive drivers from now and in the past, and we'd love to see you there. Because they're great evenings, very well supported. It's a great friendship, and the bar's open. So what more could you ask for?
All right, Steve.
Thanks very much there. We haven't got any more by the look of it. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, Harry, thank you so much for this evening. We got over the glitches to begin with. Always a success. Just to remind you, and you mentioned it, Harry, in your presentation, that we have an evening to celebrate the birth of Donald Campbell, at 7 p.m. on the 25th of March. All are welcome. Usual applications for tickets via the same address, talks@brooklandsmembers.co.uk. Again, starts at 7 o'clock. We will be holding further webinars as we go through the year, but hopefully we'll be back in person with Steve Parrish and Maria Costello on the 24th of June. So once again, Harry, thank you very much. Been brilliant to see everyone tonight or to hear from you. Like to thank everyone who's been involved in getting this together tonight, especially for Tim, who produced it and got us through some of these glitches. So to everyone, good night, take care, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.